So one question that I get asked almost daily is, when you're sharpening, do you only create one burr? Do you create multiple burrs, one on each side? Should you create a burr on every stone? Coarse grit, medium grit, fine grit? What's the deal with the burr and why is it so important when sharpening a knife? And to answer this, we're going to look at some microscope pictures as well as video to help explain and answer these questions a little bit better. So first off, why do we need to create a burr in the first place? Well, when sharpening a knife, the idea is to take one side of the knife and the other side of the knife and form an exact point or apex in the middle. So this right here is what a knife edge looks like that is not apexed. It's completely flat on top. This would not make a very sharp knife, obviously. This exact point is what gives us our apex, or the sharpened cutting edge we're looking for. Now when we sharpen our knife on a stone, we grind away material on both sides of the blade to bring the bevels together to form our apex, or our exact point in the middle. The problem is that this exact point is very small, and it can be difficult to determine when you reach this exact point or apex when you're sharpening the knife on the stone. If you move on in your sharpening process either to the next higher grit stone or onto a strop, before you create that initial apex, your knife is just not going to be that sharp. All right, coming off of a 5,000 grit stone, surely this thing's sharp. Why isn't it sharp? No matter how fine of a grit you end up going to, if you haven't created that initial apex, your knife's just not going to be sharp. Now, because we can't see the apex with our naked eye, how do we know whether or not we've actually truly formed an exact point or apex in the middle of the blade? Well, that's where the burr comes in. So rather than try and explain what a burr is, I'm just going to have to show you. So when we sharpen steel to a very fine point, the steel has a tendency to roll over itself, almost like Play-Doh does when you smash it to a very fine point. You can see this happening here on a powered belt grinder. When the steel gets to that very fine apex, the steel will start to roll over the opposite side. So this is exactly what happens on the sharpening stone when you're sharpening your knife. Now, even though that burr is very small enough that many will have a problem seeing it with their naked eye, because that burr is overhanging to one side, you should be able to feel it with your finger if you're coming off of a coarse enough stone. And this is the reason why I almost always recommend starting on a pretty coarse stone when you're sharpening a knife. So now that we know what a burr is, how do we apply this to our knife sharpening process? What does this look like in the real world? So here we have a knife that is not apexed. It's completely flat, it's dull on top. And we're going to take a look at our secondary bevels. Our secondary bevels are the actual sharpened portion of the knife. These are the bevels that we're going to bring together to form a point in the middle. Our primary grind is the actual grind shape of the knife. Now we're going to look at these secondary bevels and we're going to make sure that throughout the sharpening process, these bevels remain the same size. If we notice one getting a little bit bigger than the other, we're going to flip the knife and sharpen on the other side so that these bevels remain even on both sides of the knife. So now we'll place our knife on the stone and we're going to grind away at both sides of the knife until we formed our apex. So we'll continue doing this flipping process. We'll sharpen a little on one side of the knife. We'll flip and sharpen on the other side of the knife, keeping our bevels the same size. And we're going to feel with our finger on the opposite side that we sharpened on. So if we're sharpening in this direction, we'll feel on the top side, and I can feel a burr right there. We've formed a burr along part of this knife blade. We still have not formed a burr on another part of the blade. So keep that in mind, is that you can form a burr on certain parts of the blade, but not on others. So you want to make sure, and this is why the burr is important, that you fully form a burr down the entire length of the knife. You can even have very small sections along the apex which are not apexed yet, and you won't have a burr there. So it's very important to get that burr all the way down the entire length of the knife so that you don't have dull spots in the middle of your blade. So here's what that looks like. Towards the bottom of the image, you can see that we have formed a burr, but towards the middle and top of the apex, we have not formed one yet. This knife will not be sharp in those areas no matter how fine of a stone we go to if we have not completely formed an apex before moving on to the finer grits. That's why forming a burr is so important down the entire length of the blade. So now just a couple more passes and we've raised the burr down the entire length of the knife. So in practice, we're going to apex on our coarsest grit stone. This is a 325 grit stone, and this is what that looks like. We have a nice consistent scratch pattern and have created a burr which we can feel with our finger. So now that we formed that burr, all we have to do now is our main focus is refining the scratch pattern and minimizing and removing the burr. So we're not creating another burr on our next stone. We need to minimize and get rid of that burr. Now let me show you how quickly this can happen. We don't need to spend a ton of time on this finer stone. It happens super quick. So I'll place a knife on the stone and we're just going to do a handful of passes. 5 passes. So we have 5 passes on each side, and that's really all it takes to refine a scratch pattern. It takes way less than a lot of people think it does in order to refine the scratch pattern on your next finest grit. So as a refresher, here's what we started with: a 325 grit scratch pattern and burr, and after just 5 passes per side on the 1200 grit stone, we've completely refined the scratch pattern. And in this photo, the top photo, the burr's actually folded in the opposite direction or away from the camera. So we can't see it super clearly, but there is still a small burr left on the apex at this point. If you end up spending too much time on these finer grits, you're gonna wear out your stones faster and basically just waste a bunch of time. So now that we've refined our scratch pattern, the next step is to use light alternating passes on the stone to help minimize that burr. Essentially what that'll do is it'll work that burr back and forth over top of itself until it weakens and hopefully falls off. This works exactly like the paperclip trick. Bend the paperclip back and forth long enough and it eventually breaks. So at this point, I can't really feel a difference between either side of the blade. That lets me know that we've minimized the burr to a point where we can no longer feel it. That doesn't necessarily mean that we've completely removed the burr. And this is the apex after our alternating burr minimization passes. You can see there's still small bits and pieces hanging onto that apex. And to get that truly sharp apex and for maximum edge retention, we still need to remove these tiny little pieces. So these tiny little pieces that we see along our apex are still remnants of our original burr. We never created another one. The whole idea is to get rid of the burr. The only reason we created a burr in the first place is to help us identify that we did indeed apex completely. In a perfect world, we would stop the sharpening process the second that we apex and not create a burr at all. However, it's not a perfect world and it's absolutely impossible to do that because we can't physically see the microscopic point that we're creating on our stone. So once our burr's created on our coarsest grit, from that point forward, our entire job is to refine the scratch pattern and or remove the burr. Now we can continue to refine our scratch pattern and minimize the burr by moving on to finer grit stones. Or at any point in our stone progression, after our burr minimization passes on our last grit stone, we could continue to move on to a strop. We don't have to progress all the way out through a bunch of super fine grits. We can stop at any point after our burr minimization passes and go on to a strop to help further refine and remove the burr completely. Because I've already done plenty of videos on burr removal and why removing the burr is so important, especially for edge retention, I will link those videos below in the video description. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.